So I was watching a video this morning of a guy trying to show people how to obtain the original Boston sound, the original Boston tone. And it got me thinking of how obsessed a lot of people are with tone, trying to achieve different things. You know, when you look back in the 70s, we started with a real raw sound, and that sound was refined over time. I think people like Tom Scholz, they were pioneers in trying to achieve something over a long period of time. I think what's interesting is that although Tom was a perfectionist, I think a lot of things were achieved by accident. Hard work, of course, but by accident nonetheless. At that time, we were still pretty much working with late 60s equipment, old Marshall heads, Marshall plexis, and people were still trying to get the best sound that they possibly could using different fuzz boxes, distortion boxes, and whatnot. Ultimately, what they ended up achieving on record was not always the what I would call the most ideal sound for a guitar player in terms of what sounded good to our ears when we played live or if we played in the studio. What I mean by that is just because a guitar sound sounds great on record does not mean it's actually that user-friendly when you're actually playing live. We don't know the type of compression that was used, you know, different saturation qualities that they achieved. So trying to achieve Tom Scholz's sound, his 70s sound anyway, for the first and the second album, I guess it's fun to do, but I think it's also important to point out that the Rockman sound was an evolution of what Tom originally came up with. Tom wasn't stuck in 1976. He was a tone chaser. He loved the saturation qualities of a cranked Marshall amp, especially the power section, not the preamp section, but the power section. And there were certain qualities you could get out of an amp just by turning it up to 10. His issue was he wanted to be able to achieve that sound at a quieter volume, a lower level. Anyway, as the sustainer evolved, and actually prior to that, when the Rockman was developed, and as the sustainer evolved, none of that was to achieve his sound off the first album. It was to improve on it for what Tom wanted to hear from his point of view, what he thought sounded good, and it was an evolution. It's funny that as the Rockman equipment was developed, it continued to get better and better and better and better. Now, if you're going to argue about, well, it didn't sound like the first album, well, what were we trying to achieve? Were we constantly trying to achieve something from the first album or the second album? No, Tom was a writer. He continued to write and reinvent how the guitar sounded all the way through the 80s and then into the 90s. In fact, one of the last things that SR&D came out with in the early 90s was the Ultimatum preamp, or the Ultimatum distortion generator, which was featured on the Walk On album. In my opinion, the best guitar sound that Boston ever had was off the Walk On album. Now, of course, some people who are purists are going to argue that point, but why argue? You know, the idea of debating what someone likes over someone else is kind of crazy. It's almost like listening to people that are blues purists say, well, that's not blues, or this isn't blues, or that's not, how can it be blues? You've got too much gain. And that's crazy. That is absolutely crazy. People find things to debate about that really aren't debatable. What's important to note is that Tom was always tone chasing. It is absolutely no different than Eddie Van Halen, Ted Nugent, Joe Satriani, Steve Vai. Those guys were all tone chasers. And as they grew in the music business, their guitar sounds got better or worse in some cases. I can give you a good example of that with Eddie Van Halen. But again, this is my opinion for all that it's worth. You know, you take something like the 1984 album, it was a bizarre album. It was almost like Eddie didn't have any gain on his guitar at all. And then you listen to something like For Unlawful Carnal Knowledge, he had tons of gain. Or off the 5150 album. They were always refining what they were trying to achieve. And it might have changed from day to day depending on what mood they were in at the time. So, you know, when you look at the Rockman stuff, you can't look at it in terms of, you know, Tom was trying to, you know, he was stuck in a bubble where he was continuously trying to find something to recreate the first album or the second album. Far, far from the truth. So it got me thinking about that, you know, watching that video of someone trying to achieve that sound. Again, you know, what you pump into the front end of an amp to obtain a tone that was achieved on an album is not necessarily going to give you the most satisfying tone when you're playing the guitar live. A good example of that is it's playing through a MXR Dynacom and a DoD Overdrive 250. They sound absolutely sweet, but live, you know. Now recording, you know, whether you would achieve a great sound using those two things or not, I don't know. I guess it doesn't matter. So in the world of Rockman, I think people ought to just take it for what it's worth. It's face value. Do you like the Rockman sound? Yeah. Does it sound like the first and second albums, the Boston albums, or even the third stage album? Yeah. But you know what? If it doesn't, who cares? Tom was searching just like all of us. Do I think that the Rockman sound is one of the greatest guitar tones? Yeah. I think if you were gonna box it in like that, yeah, it's a wonderful tone. There's 4 good tones that Tom thought would be good to have. If you look behind me, the amplifiers that I own are all Rockman. None of them are Marshalls. I'm not using any kind of overdrive. They're all fine-tuned. But do any of them sound like the first and second albums? No. If you play through those amplifiers, are you going to feel like you've died and gone to heaven? Yes. So it's an interesting thing. That's why I think people need to focus on what sounds good to them. Don't get so hung up, again, on trying to find a tone that was achieved on an album. Another point to make is that we just don't know what went on in the studio. Yeah, Tom recorded all the demos, but when it came to mastering and making the final product, there's always decisions made, there's always compression that's considered, there's always other things in the studio that are considered. I mean, even the board itself, the mixing board itself, is always taken into consideration. There's just a lot of things that we don't know. So beating our heads against the wall, trying to find a tone, yeah, go for it. Any pedal that you can possibly come up with could come close to some album or some tone that you're really trying to achieve. But, you know, who cares what pedal it is? Whether it's something you come up with, whether it's something some guy on YouTube comes up with. I mean, really, it's you know, life is about the journey and what you discover for yourself. And there are no wrong answers. So again, I just thought I'd throw this video up there and see what people think. I think one of the things I've learned in my Rockman journey and in everything that I've been doing over the last 25 years is that people just need to realize that you know, it's all a journey in you know, self-discovery. What you can come up with, not necessarily trying to spend so much time trying to achieve something that somebody else did. We have our inspirations, we have our heroes, but you always have to keep in mind that all those people that inspired us were also always trying to achieve something a little bit better, something that sounded good to them. You know, it's funny, you hear people talk about Boston's later albums. A lot of people don't even realize they had later albums. But, you know, Tom Scholz doesn't sound anything like he did in the later albums. He didn't sound anything like he did in the earlier albums. Well, that's because he grew as a musician. His tastes changed in what he was doing. And some people can actually argue that in the end, he wasn't that great of a guitar player. Well, again, who's to say? That's your opinion, that's this guy's opinion, that person's opinion. It doesn't matter, because Tom Scholz is his own person, and you need to discover what you like, what drives you to play the guitar, what tone really brings out the best in you. So it's a good conversation. Again, I think it's why I always stray away from people that claim to be purists or have a purist attitude. I don't think that's where it's at. I don't think that brings happiness. I think being a purist or trying to capture something from the past can kind of lock people in. We need to broaden our horizons, you know, and there's always something new to discover. So, hope everybody's having a great 2024. I hope to come out with more videos in the future, explaining some of the workings of some of my amplifiers and some of the things I've discovered over the years. But I thought I'd just sit down and make this little video as a first video from just playing or doing anything like that. I hope you enjoyed this subject, and we'll see you soon.